Okay, the purpose of this little video is just to get you a real basic familiarity with the anatomy of the heart. You will do the details in lab, but to be able to deal with some of the physiology, once you get familiar with a few of the structures. So when we think about the cardiovascular system, which is the heart and the vessels and the blood they contain, we got to get blood to the tissues because this blood has oxygen, it has nutrients, and it'll take away waste. The heart is the pump of that system. So let's walk through a little bit of the anatomy of the heart. So I want to cover a couple basic terms since I know you're going to do this lab before you do the heart lectures. So one of the things we talk about is the systemic circulation versus the pulmonary circulation. The systemic circulation is between the heart and all the body parts that are not the lungs. And so blood will go from heart out to the organs of the body, from organs of the body back to the heart. That's the systemic circulation. The pulmonary circulation then is just moving blood between the heart and the lungs, and then the lungs back to the heart. Okay. So here's a little picture of that. So here we are. Let me change my color. Here we are in the right side of the heart. And from the right side of the heart, blood goes to each lung and then comes back into the left side of the heart. And what I just highlighted in green, that's your pulmonary circulation. And then in the systemic circulation, we're going to try that in orange. Blood leaves the left side of the heart and goes out to various organs. Gas exchange happens, so the blood's deoxygenated, now it comes back into the right atrium, and now we're going to go through the right side of the heart and back to the lungs. And so that's the systemic circulation. So this is just important because for anatomy anyway, the way we learn vessels, the vessels in the systemic and in the pulmonary circulation are set up and named a little differently. So specifically, arteries versus veins. People mess up on this a lot, so let's be careful. Arteries are carrying blood away from the heart. Okay. Got nothing to do with what kind of blood is in there. In the systemic system, systemic arteries are carrying oxygenated blood. So it's that bright red blood we talked about. In the pulmonary circulation, the pulmonary arteries are carrying deoxygenated blood. Now, there are two main pulmonary arteries, one that goes from the right ventricle to the right lung and one that goes from the right ventricle to the left lung. And they have many, many branches, but there are those two main arteries. So yes, the vast majority of arteries in your body are in the systemic circulation and they're carrying oxygenated blood. But we got to be careful with that pulmonary circulation. Veins then are bringing blood back to or toward the heart. In the systemic circulation, systemic veins have blood that has passed through the capillaries and given its oxygens to the tissues. So systemic veins carry deoxygenated blood. Now the pulmonary veins, we got four main pulmonary veins, two from each lung, all dumping blood back into the left atrium. Blood in those veins has just been through the lungs. It is oxygenated. And again, vast majority of veins in your body are in the systemic circulation and therefore carry deoxygenated blood. This translates then to what we see on models or pictures. So by convention, we're going to see red vessels and we're going to see blue vessels. The red vessels are carrying oxygenated blood. And those would be what? Those would be systemic arteries are going to be red. The vast majority of red vessels on a picture, again, are going to be arteries. But then pulmonary veins are carrying oxygenated blood. Blue vessels on our models or pictures then are carrying deoxygenated blood. Now we know this blood's not blue, it's dark red, but that blue color just makes it easy for us on models or pictures. Blue vessels on our models on our pictures are going to be our systemic veins. So again, vast majority of veins are in the systemic circulation. And our pulmonary arteries. We'll look through this and look at some pictures of it, but get this in your brain. This plagues people in cardiac anatomy and vessel anatomy. Okay, here again is a picture of that circulation. So here is the right side of the heart. From the right ventricle here, we are going to send out two pulmonary arteries. That blood flows through the lungs. Now it's nice and oxygenated. It is headed back to the heart via these pulmonary veins. And again, you got two coming from each lung. So there's the other one. That's the pulmonary circulation. Now, let's clear that for a minute. Let's erase this real quick and let's look at systemic circulation. So systemic circulation, we start in the left ventricle, leave the left ventricle, headed out to the capillary beds that feed all the organs. These are our systemic arteries. We're going away from the heart, and yes, these do have oxygenated blood. We pass through the capillary beds, and what happens there is oxygen leaves this blood and goes and supplies the tissues. Head back to the heart via the systemic veins. And again, vast majority of veins in your body are going to be blue because the vast majority of veins in your body are in the systemic circulation. Okay, so let's move into kind of some gross anatomy of the heart. We think about the heart as having a left side and a right side. Each side has a superior chamber called an atrium, inferior chamber called a ventricle. What we're getting at with this particular picture right now is just that the myocardium, okay, and so this is the left ventricle. That's the myocardium of the left ventricle. Here's the myocardium of the right ventricle. Why is that so much thicker? It is not because of a difference in the amount of blood pumped. These two ventricles have to pump the same amount of blood with every beat, otherwise you've got a bunch of blood stuck somewhere. Okay. It is because the left ventricle has got to generate more pressure because the left ventricle pumps blood through the systemic arteries. So all the way down to your toes, all the way up to the top of your head. The right ventricle has just got to get blood to the lungs. So the left ventricle, the myocardium, is much thicker because it's got to generate more pressure. We'll talk a lot more about that in our physiology lectures. Okay, so let's look at external anatomy of the heart. This is an anterior view. And remember, your right and left, it's the right and left belonging to the person or the model. Okay, so the person whose heart this is. So it's as if we took this person's sternum and ribs off, looking straight at them at their heart. So this is going to be left, and this is right. Okay. So how do I tell chambers from this view? So chambers are divided. I'm trying to find something that'll show up you can see really blood vessels dividing the chambers. So you have this group of vessels that run here and here. Okay. They are in a groove called the coronary sulcus. Remember sulcus from the brain? The groove, okay. That divides the atria, or the two superior chambers, from the ventricles. And then we see a set of vessels here. They also lay in a groove. That groove is the anterior interventricular, or between the ventricles, also sulcus. So when that again is a groove. On pictures, obviously you can't see a groove, but vessels lay in that groove. Okay. So this is the right ventricle. Here's a little bit of the left ventricle. Again, the left ventricle is not smaller. It's just that the way the heart sits in the chest, when we look at an anterior view, we see a lot more right ventricle. Okay, so that's kind of basic stuff. Let's clear this off and we'll talk a little bit more about the chambers. This is an anterior view again. So my chambers, atria on top, ventricles on bottom. What we end up seeing from an anterior view with the atria are these little things called auricles. Okay. And the auricles are just kind of wrinkly appendages of the atria. Okay, so you would say here is the right auricle, and here is the left auricle. Okay. And we'll see more of the structure of the atria from an inner view of the heart and then from the posterior view. And then here we've got a right ventricle, and again, a little bit of left ventricle. So the other things we're going to worry about here are the big vessels leaving the heart. So what's going to happen? The right ventricle is going to pump blood up and out this structure here. Okay. That is the pulmonary trunk. Okay, let's actually take a minute and erase. We'll start back over. So let's again all right, let's think about our big vessels. Again, right ventricle is sending blood this way. That little stub from there to there is what we call the pulmonary trunk, which is very quickly going to split into pulmonary arteries. And there's the left one. And we've got a right one. It's kind of buried under the rest of this stuff. This is a blue artery because it's carrying deoxygenated blood headed to the lungs to get oxygenated. Here would be a little snippet of that right pulmonary artery. The other blue vessels we see in this picture are these two, and these are bringing blood into the right atrium. And this is the vena cava. It's a systemic vein, deoxygenated blood. Above the heart, there's the superior one. Below is the inferior one. And we're going to see the inferior one all the way down into the abdomen. Okay, so vena cava, again, systemic vein, pulmonary artery, pulmonary trunk, and then the two pulmonary arteries. All right, red vessels we see in this picture. Remember, if it's red, it's not necessarily an artery, but it is carrying oxygenated blood. Main one we see that's real prominent here is the aorta. Okay. And the aorta comes up from the left ventricle and does this loop. So what that gives us is we get the ascending aorta. We have the aortic arch, which is just what it looks like, the arch. And then the one that's headed down this way is the descending thoracic aorta. Thoracic is important, guys, because the aorta is going to go all the way through the diaphragm and into the abdominal cavity. So we also have an abdominal aorta. And then the other red vessels we've got are pulmonary veins. You got two on each side. So these are the left pulmonary veins. And they're bringing blood back from the lungs into that left atrium. And it's going to flow through the left side of the heart. And here would be the right ones, but they're tough to see in this picture. So now we're looking, again, still an anterior view, but now we've taken off the kind of the front wall of the heart. Things to notice here are going to be our chambers. So here's a right atrium, right ventricle, tiny little left atrium, but again, it's not small, it's just in this view we don't see a ton of it. And then the left ventricle. So those are our chambers. Things we also are going to see are 4 valves. So we have this valve here, I'm going to call it 1. It is between the right atrium and the right ventricle. It's the door. It is the right atrioventricular valve. It is also called the tricuspid valve. It keeps blood from flowing backwards. That's the point of these valves. So blood should flow from the atrium into the ventricle, not the opposite way. And that valve is the door that prevents that from happening. The other atrioventricular valve is the left. Okay. The left AV valve or atrioventricular valve, also called bicuspid, also called mitral. So for both of these guys, you're going to have to learn all their names because they just get used interchangeably. So you're going to be able to either recognize or give me bicuspid or mitral or left AV or right AV or tricuspid, because unfortunately that's just how they end up getting used. Then we have valves that are going to be between the ventricles and the big arteries that are leaving the heart. So let's erase so we can get a better view of them. And those are the semi-lunar valves. So here's here's one, and then up in here's the other one. So this one, I numbered it 1, is the pulmonary semilunar, or you also can say pulmonic valve. Okay. And it is between this right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk. So blood should be going the direction I just showed. It keeps blood from going backwards from the pulmonary trunk to the right ventricle, which is not the way it should go. And then here, number 2 is the aortic semilunar valve, or just aortic's okay. It is between the left ventricle and the aorta, and it prevents blood from going from the aorta to the left ventricle. Okay, so blood's going to go through it like this, and then the aorta kind of lays back under here behind the pulmonary trunk. So other things we see in here are these little things called papillary muscles and tendinous cords. Those are going to help anchor the AV valves. So one of the things we ask you to learn in this lab and in lecture really is the flow of blood through the heart and circulation. What this means is I am going to pretend that you are a blood cell. You can be whatever kind you like. And you're going to take a trip around the whole body. Okay. And we're going to think about what structures do you pass? This is not going to mean anything to you now, but I got to say it 1,000 times because students forget this is not the cardiac cycle. Cardiac cycle has to do with which chambers contract. Okay. This is circulation and sort of the circulatory pathway. So I'm a blood cell, I'm taking a trip. What am I going to pass? By convention, we usually start in the right atrium. Now, this is a circle. You can start anywhere and the result is the same, but we got to start somewhere. So our convention in that your book uses to start at the right atrium. If I give you a question about this, I'm going to instruct you to start at the right atrium. But again, it's a circle. There is no beginning and there is no end. So big picture, we do right side of heart. We do lungs and the pulmonary circulation. We do left side of heart. We do systemic circulation. And then we're right back to the right side of the heart. But there's a ton of structures in between. So what you're going to want to think about naming is the chambers, the valves, and the very big vessels. So let's look. Here's a little schematic I did. So let's say you're starting in the right atrium. You're going to flow through the right AV valve, into the right ventricle, then through the pulmonic valve, out the pulmonary trunk and arteries, and into the lungs, or we could call this the pulmonary circulation. What I have done with this picture is my blue areas are where deoxygenated blood is. Purple areas is where it changes. So in the lungs, this deoxygenated blood goes in, picks up oxygen, comes out oxygenated. Okay. So right atrium, right AV, right ventricle, pulmonic valve, the pulmonary trunk and arteries, through the lungs, out of the lungs via the pulmonary veins. So we're headed back to the heart. This is oxygenated blood. In the left side of the heart, from the pulmonary vein, we go to the left atrium, through the left AV valve, and into the left ventricle, through the aortic valve, and out into the aorta, and then the aorta branches into all the systemic arteries. Now we're in the systemic circulation. In the systemic circulation, I've drawn it purple, so the blood is going to leave oxygen for the cells, and it's going to go from oxygenated to deoxygenated. Then we're back into the systemic veins, eventually ending in the superior and inferior vena cava, and then back into the right atrium, and we start over. So you'd need to list that from scratch. I'll start you at the right atrium, but you want to go through and give me the valves, the chambers, the big vessels. And so the big vessels would just be the pulmonary trunk and its arteries, the pulmonary veins, the aorta, and then the two vena cava. Right? So again, I'm a little blood cell. Where am I going?